The Life and Philosophy of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. A Storyteller's Perspective. Once upon a time, in the heart of Germany, in a town called Stuttgart, a child was born who would one day shape the very way we understand history, reality, and thought itself. His name was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, and his journey from an ordinary boy to one of the greatest philosophers of all time was anything but simple. The Life of Hegel, a story of thought and struggle. It was August 27, 1770, when Hegel first opened his eyes to the world. Born into a Protestant family, young Hegel was raised with a strong sense of duty and education. His father worked as a civil servant, and his mother, though she died young, left a deep impression on him with her intelligence and warmth. As a child, he was not considered a genius, far from it. While others marveled at the quick wit of some of his peers, Hegel was more of a slow-burning thinker, someone who mulled over ideas for days, weeks, even years before forming conclusions. His early education at the Stuttgart Gymnasium exposed him to classical literature, mathematics, and philosophy, but it was his time at the Tübinger Stift, a Protestant seminary, that truly set him on his intellectual path. Here he shared a room with two other young men who would also leave their mark on the world, the poet Friedrich Hölderlin and the philosopher Friedrich Schelling. Together they dreamed of reshaping the world with ideas inspired by the French Revolution and the spirit of human freedom. After university, Hegel spent several years as a private tutor, struggling financially and intellectually. But it was in Jena, where he eventually became a lecturer, that his ideas truly began to take form. Here, under the shadow of the great philosopher Immanuel Kant, and in the presence of his contemporary Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Hegel began to craft his unique system of thought, one that would later be called absolute idealism. However, life was not easy for him. When Napoleon's army occupied Jena in 1806, Hegel famously finished writing The Phenomenology of Spirit, while chaos erupted in the streets. He later moved to Nuremberg, then Heidelberg, and finally to Berlin, where he gained widespread recognition as a professor and philosopher. Hegel's fame grew, and he became the most influential thinker of his era. But in 1831, his life was abruptly cut short by a cholera epidemic, leaving behind a legacy that would influence generations to come. Hegel's philosophy, a grand system of thought. Hegel's philosophy is vast and complex, but at its core lies the idea that reality is shaped by dialectical development. This means that everything evolves through a process of contradictions, thesis, antithesis, and their resolution in synthesis. This cycle, according to Hegel, is how history progresses, how ideas develop, and how consciousness itself unfolds. Hegelian dialectic, the logic of change. At the heart of Hegel's thought is his dialectical method, a dynamic process in which contradictions are not merely obstacles but essential forces of progress. This dialectic is often simplified into three stages. Thesis, a given idea or state of being, representing an initial position or understanding. Antithesis, a contradiction or opposition that emerges in response to the thesis, challenging its validity. Synthesis, a resolution that reconciles the contradiction, forming a higher and more developed truth. However, Hegel's dialectic is far more intricate than this three-step model suggests. He did not see it as a rigid formula, but as a living movement that drives history, philosophy, and human consciousness toward greater levels of self-awareness. For example, in The Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel illustrates how human consciousness evolves dialectically. One of his most famous examples is the master-slave dialectic. in which two self-conscious beings struggle for recognition. The master, who dominates, depends on the slave for recognition, while the slave, through labor and experience, gains self-awareness. This dynamic ultimately subverts itself, showing that true self-consciousness requires mutual recognition, not domination. Dialectics in history and society. Hegel saw history itself as dialectical. Societies develop through conflicts. Feudalism gives way to capitalism, autocratic rule gives way to democracy, and so on. Each stage in history is a necessary step toward the realization of human freedom. He famously declared, "The history of the world is none other than the progress of the consciousness of freedom." This historical dialectic means that no state of affairs is final. Every form of government, every moral system, and every social order carries within it the seeds of its own transformation. For Hegel, this did not mean history was chaotic or meaningless. Rather, it had an inner logic, a rational unfolding toward the realization of freedom and self-awareness. Hegel's absolute, the ultimate reality. For Hegel, the dialectic ultimately leads to the realization of the absolute, a state where all contradictions are reconciled, and reality is understood as a unified whole. The absolute is not a static entity, but a dynamic, self-developing totality. In this sense, reality itself is a process of thought coming to understand itself. He expressed this grand vision in the science of logic, arguing that logic itself follows a dialectical structure, moving from being to nothing to becoming, and ultimately toward an understanding of reality as an interconnected whole. The absolute is not something separate from the world, but the world itself, grasped in its fullest conceptual development. Hegel's most famous quotes. Hegel was a master of profound and often enigmatic statements. Some of his most famous quotes include, "The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk," meaning that philosophy understands reality only after events have already unfolded. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational, suggesting that reality is shaped by reason, even when it seems chaotic. We learn from history that we do not learn from history, a reflection on humanity's tendency to repeat mistakes. Legacy. A thinker for the ages. Hegel's influence cannot be overstated. His ideas laid the foundation for many philosophical movements, from existentialism to Marxism. He inspired thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard, Karl Marx, Jean-Paul Sartre, and even modern political theorists. His work continues to be debated and reinterpreted, proving that his philosophy is as alive today as it was in his time. Hegel was not just a philosopher. He was a visionary who saw the world as a grand unfolding of ideas, moving toward a deeper understanding of truth. And though his words may be difficult, and his concepts complex, those who take the time to engage with his thought will find a thinker whose ideas continue to shape the very way we see ourselves and our place in history. And so, the story of Hegel does not truly end. It continues in every discussion of history, in every exploration of ideas, and in every individual striving to understand the world through reason and contradiction. For as long as thought exists, Hegel's spirit remains. For example, in The Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel illustrates how human consciousness evolves dialectically. One of his most famous examples is the master-slave dialectic, in which two self-conscious beings struggle for recognition. The master, who dominates, depends on the slave for recognition, while the slave, through labor and experience, gains self-awareness. This dynamic ultimately subverts itself, showing that true self-consciousness requires mutual recognition, not domination.